As a former state commissioner myself, I'm delighted to introduce Emile Thompson, Chairman of the DC Public Service Commission, for this episode of Energy Solutions. Chairman Thompson and I discuss how he went from clerking of criminal law to lead regulator in the nation's capital and everything in between. We talk about the specific energy challenges DC faces and how these challenges have evolved through the decades. Chairman Thompson unpacks DC's regulatory framework and how it works for the way DC is uniquely structured. And we talk about what policymakers and other regulators should have in mind as the nation's grid continues to electrify. You're listening to Energy Solutions, a podcast from the Electric Power Supply Association. I'm your host, Todd Snitchler, EPSA's President and CEO. Let's get to the conversation. Thanks, Mr. Chairman, for joining us today. We've certainly got a lot to chat about. We were glad to have you join us at the Competitive Power Summit, and I thought your opening comments were a terrific way for us to kick off our conference. It also doesn't hurt that I had a DC native who was willing to share his thoughts about the city's inner workings, the energy challenges, and what we need both inside and out of the energy space. So we were delighted to have you there and are really glad to have you join us here on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me here today.
So as you know, let's jump right in. Our members and our member companies operate in a large number of regions throughout the nation, and it's not often we get a chance to talk about what's going on in our own backyard. So we're very interested in your insights here as an energy policy leader in Washington, D.C. But before we talk about that, you've got a background in law and criminal justice. I always ask people, what brought you to the Public Service Commission? Because all of us have kind of a strange way we got here. I'm always curious what our guests' path to get to the Public Service Commission is.
Yes, that's a great question. Like you noted, I went to law school, and initially coming out of law school, I clerked here in DC on Superior Court for a judge handling criminal matters, both felony 1 and felony 2 matters. So everything from gun possession to homicide and sexual assault.
Wow.
Following that, I then worked in 2 mayoral administrations here, really focusing on public safety policy, coordination between your public safety organizations, so the police department, fire department, Department of Corrections. And then I went to the U.S. Attorney's Office here in D.C., which uniquely enough is the only U.S. Attorney's Office that does not only just federal prosecution, but local prosecution as well. So
Sure.
While there, I prosecuted everything from misdemeanors to homicides. And when I left, I was a deputy chief there. But I give up that long recitation because while I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office, I talked to the mayor and said, I still want to continue to serve the city in a direct way. And it was at that point she appointed me to the board of DC Water. DC Water is our water utility here. It's unregulated because it's a municipal organization. And so the board of directors kind of serves as the regulator.
Yep.
That rates, deal with infrastructure. And so a lot of the focus on a lot of the same things we do at the Public Service Commission: safety, reliability, and affordability. And so when the opportunity came up on the Public Service Commission, I jumped at the opportunity. I think where we are right now in this energy transition we're at such an inflection point, and I was very happy to have this opportunity. Now, the interesting thing I'll note is when I first became a commissioner, I thought, I have plenty of time just to be a little baby commissioner, learn the ropes. Right. And a couple months into the job, the then chairman, Willie Phillips, said, hey, I'm leaving, I'm going to FERC. And so quickly became chairman, and it's been a whirlwind, but it's been truly great so far.
And you've got a lot on your plate, as all the state chairmen and state commissioners do, but I think you're doing a terrific job. So as you're looking at it from your seat, let's kind of start small and work our way out a little bit. What are some of the biggest challenges that you see that Washington, D.C. is facing related to electricity? Is it bills? Is it reliability? Is it environmental issues? Or is it kind of a mix of all those? And how are you looking at how DC is going to navigate its way through all those challenges?
If you had asked me this question, let's say 10, 15 years ago, I would have said safety and reliability were really big challenges in DC. 10, 15 years ago, we would suffer from a fair amount of outages, unplanned outages. If a storm came through, because we have so much infrastructure above ground, we would suffer from days-long blackouts and things of that nature, which were just unacceptable in a nation's capital. Our safety and SAIDI numbers were very low, but that's really turned itself around, I think, for a number of reasons. One, I think we've developed a really robust regulatory framework in the district that's allowed for the utility to make the necessary investments and allow them to get that recovery they need to make sure that the system is safe and reliable. Sometimes people, you say robust regulatory framework, they get a little scared of that. But I think I think it's worked really well here in
Sure.
Washington, D.C. One example would be the DC Plug Initiative, which is a public-private partnership between the government and Pepco, our electric utility, to
Hmm.
underground some of our most vulnerable feeders,
Yeah.
such that when we have these big storms come through, we don't suffer these prolonged outages. I think we also benefited from, quite frankly, the Pepco Exelon merger, being able to leverage those economies of scale when it comes to purchasing necessary equipment, bringing best practices to the district. And then again, when you have these storms, being able to leverage on that mutual assistance from sister utilities up and down the East Coast. So, what would I say is the biggest challenge right now? I'd probably say maintain affordability in the midst of this energy transition. And I think that's a real challenge. By way of background, in DC, we said that by 2032, 100% of our electricity is going to come from renewable sources. And then that by 2041, 15% of electricity has to be generated within the boundaries of the district. We also say that we're going to reach carbon neutrality by 2045. I think what makes these goals particularly challenging is that, unlike any other jurisdiction, DC is a dense urban environment.
Yep.
And so when you start talking about generation and utility scale generation, we don't have the space for that. And we don't have any currently, thermal or renewable. And so when you think about carbon neutrality, at least it's a little bit easier because we're not fighting our generating plants and trying to figure out how to make them carbon neutral. But it does create a real problem when you start talking about generating that electricity within the boundaries and just getting in general when you have no control over what's really being built to feed that system.
Right. So we talk a lot about the energy transition. You've already mentioned it, but as you know, we like to call it the energy expansion because I think we've got a lot of balls in the air at the moment. So in this industry, as you well know, the phrase the energy trilemma comes up a lot, maybe too much sometimes. But how do you and the commission see the relationship between maintaining and preserving grid reliability, supporting decarbonization? You just listed a number of pretty important goals that have been set out by the government, as well as working to enable that cost savings. I mean, those three legs on that stool often struggle to stay in balance. How are you thinking about doing that? And how do you think DC is navigating that process?
Yeah, I think it's the question that's in front of almost every regulator, right? And I think DC is doing a good job. You know, I talked about some of the challenges on the micro level in terms of DC, but I think we quickly go to the macro level because when we're talking about that energy mix, the energy expansion, we're relying in DC on our RTO, and that's PJM, and that's been very huge for us. But I think you can have decarbonization, grid reliability, and affordability, but it just takes planning and foresight. And so we can't expect that the way we've done things will get us where we need to go. And so some of the things I just want to touch on briefly when I think about foresight and planning are things that we've been working on in the PJM region, obviously, and that's certainly capacity reform, interconnection queue reform, and then long-term planning. I think those are essential things when we start talking about decarbonization, grid reliability, and affordability. You know, the capacity markets, were really created to ensure that PJM had the necessary resource adequacy and reliability. And PJM recently went through phase one of its reform process, which we were happy with or satisfied with. Let me say satisfied with, expecting that with any reform, there's going to be multiple iterations. And so we like the capacity accreditation, the testing requirements, but we certainly want to see a more granular capacity design, whether it's seasonal, hourly, I'm not entirely sure. Looking at weather history and modeling in a more comprehensive manner. But I think all this is important because we have to send the right price signals to incent the resources we need on the grid.
Couldn't agree with
different resources will provide different characteristics, right? They have different attributes. And so I'm a firm proponent that even though we have these transition goals, right, that we have to maintain certain resources on the grid to ensure that the lights stay on when the sun isn't shining, the wind isn't blowing, and the batteries can't discharge anymore. And so capacity markets, supremely important. And then interconnection reform. We have to continue to reform our interconnection process. Again, PJM has made some steps there. But I think we have to continue to do more and figure out how we can really shorten that time.
Mm-hmm.
There's a stat that PJM talks about that, well, we've cleared 40 gigawatts, 40,000 megawatts, but they haven't been built yet. Well, part of that is because it took so long to clear that these projects are no longer viable, and we can't have that. And so how do we continue to work in a timely manner to interconnect generation? One of the things that we've talked about among the states is capacity injection rights, right? How do we leverage those to more efficiently, more effectively bring resources online so we're not just building transmission all the time as the stopgap? And then, of course, when we talk about planning, got to touch on 1920. I think that's certainly key to where we're going. If you look at the costs in PJM for transmission alone, I think over the last 5 years, we maybe spent about $8 million in baseline projects, but 25 billion in supplemental. And to me, that speaks to a lack of proper planning, right? And I think this really allows us to look at planning, looking at all the assumptions across the RTO, all the inputs, and effectively plan going forward.
Yeah, that's a big number. I mean, I know we sometimes talk about the system needing upgrades, and certainly there are things that need to be done, but that's a big number over the last several years to go in. So you mentioned a moment ago about how you think about the resources that we need to stay on the system. I'm curious how you think about natural gas or other dispatchable, non-renewable resources that are going to continue to be needed as we look at how we get from here to whatever our ultimate policy destination is. And as you think about the framework that you have to operate in and some of the other states, how do you see those fitting into the portfolio of resources that are going to be needed for the foreseeable future? You can define the timeline if you want, but I think most folks acknowledge that we're going to need them for at least quite a while. How long that is, I'm not certain I know either, but I'm curious how you're thinking about it in light of some of your mandates from policymakers about things you're supposed to accomplish.
I'll go on record as saying, I mean, I think for the foreseeable future, we will need fossil fuel baseload thermal generation. Now, what the proper mix and component is, whether it's natural gas and coal, natural gas and nuclear, and to what percentage in terms of the total mix, I don't have that, but I think there is certainly a future. I mean, if you look just at the hard numbers, I think PJM is predicting that by 2034, they're going to have increased demand of maybe 45,000 megawatts. Right. And then by 2030, they're looking at 40,000 megawatts of retirements. That's a net of 85,000 megawatts. So I think we're going to actually quickly get to a place where it's going to be any megawatt. Doesn't I don't want to say it doesn't matter, but we're going to need every megawatt. Right. And, I think it's, we have to be real that the technology isn't there in terms of battery storage. Doesn't mean it won't get there, but it's just not there today. And so we'll certainly need this base load generation to provide reliability. And then a lot of the stuff that we have coming online is not a 1-for-1 megawatt transfer. So these all tell me that we will need that base load generation. What I will say in terms of decarbonization, and these resources is I'm encouraged that I think our gas turbines are getting much more efficient, right? Which means higher output with lower emissions, which is going to help us. Also, what we saw down in Georgia with Vogtle coming online, right? That's baseload generation, carbon free. And so I think looking at all these and various technologies coming online, whether it's carbon capture, SMR, all these will play a part in ensuring that we have that baseload generation using some of our traditional fossil fuels.
Yeah, I think we'd agree with that because, as you know, this misalignment of retirements and additions and the types of resources has, I think, got everybody's full attention. I mean, I think people didn't necessarily believe that it was coming, and now I think everyone universally agrees it's not coming, it's here. So how are we going to tackle and address that? So you've stated many times, including so far in our conversation, about energy affordability being a prime concern for you and for the DC Public Service Commission. How are you thinking about the best way to minimize costs to taxpayers when it comes to building new resources or when it comes to transmission infrastructure, kind of all of the inputs that go into a utility bill that people ultimately have to pay? Because in the end, as people say, you tell an engineer what you want them to do and they'll build it for you, but somebody's got to pay the bill for it.
So how do you
Right.
think about navigating through some of the things we want to accomplish and maintaining cost effectiveness? Because I'll disclose my priors. We, of course, think that the markets help deliver because they take that cost off of ratepayers and put it on investors and shareholders. Not everybody shares that view, but certainly that's our perspective. I'm just curious how you're thinking about it because I know that's a prime concern for you, and none of these solutions are inexpensive. So how do
Right.
we collaborate to figure out how to minimize those costs?
Well, I think, starting where you left off there, I think PJM has an amazing stat, and I can't recall off the top of my head about the value proposition of PJM in terms of the amount of money they save consumers. And so I certainly think the RTO in the competitive markets, there has certainly been a cost savings from that point of view.
For sure.
And there will continue to be one. Again, if we continue to plan and do things in an efficient manner. As a retail regulator, one of the things that we always say is the cheapest kilowatt, because that's what we deal with on the on that end, is the one that's not used, right? And
Yeah.
so I think about that same principle when we think of transmission build out in terms of alternative transmission technologies, GETs, grid enhancing technologies.
Yep.
What can we do to really get all we can out of what's existing? Some of that's also tied into the interregional conversation, right? How can we share power so that in these extreme events, we have that resource adequacy without having to build, sorry, much to your dismay, 5 or 10 more generating plants, but things of that nature. And then on the retail level, we have a number of programs that we've really put in to really kind of help consumers, especially residential consumers at the retail level. We have a utility discount programs that allow those who make below a certain threshold have a bill discount, and that's been hugely successful, I think, in DC, especially when you have such a diverse population base with such economic variety, right? And
Yeah, it's a wide variety.
Exactly. So there's some people who will have a $10 bill increase and it won't make a difference, and other people that's huge. And so
Yes.
our utility discount programs hugely effective. We've seen enrollment in those jump since COVID, and so that's certainly big for us. We've also encouraged our utilities to really look at funding through IIJA and IRA, right?
Yeah.
To help defray some of those costs. We've opened up dockets to track that. But I think the biggest thing we can do to keep costs low is ensure, one, that we're getting everything we can out of the existing infrastructure, and two, planning when we build so that we're building with intentionality and not just building one-offs.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. So I'm not sure if you have news to break or you want to break news on our podcast, but are there any programs or initiatives or things that you're contemplating or that are coming up on the horizon for the DC Public Service Commission? We're always interested because, the 50 state laboratories and 51, if you count the district, there's a lot of interesting things happening. And I'm always curious about what that might be because they're difficult to keep up with, but you know far better than we do about what you're up to.
Yeah, I'll touch on a few things. One of the things that we've been working on, I've talked about the 2032 all electricity must come from renewable sources goal. One of the things we've been working on is trying to get a PPA for our standard offer service or service of last resort to have 5% of that service by a renewable facility within the PJM footprint.
Okay.
We put it out to bid a number of years ago, and one of the conditions was that it had to be a greenfield facility. And we got a successful bid back, but as things with COVID got worse and supply chain got tighter, as well as Russia and Ukraine, the contract ended up being terminated. So we put it back out.
Okay.
We changed some of the provisions to allow for a little bit more flexibility. The biggest now is that now it does have to be a greenfield facility, but we're really hoping that will maybe yield something for us in terms of helping us get to our goal. I would also note that, like many states probably on the East Coast, because of our goals, we've asked our utilities to file plans about how they're going to meet the district's energy transition goals.
Yep.
And so 5 and 30-year plans. So we certainly hope to have some movement on that soon. And then, of course, I have to put a plug in for our Clean Energy Summit that comes up in October 30th of this year. We'll be talking about, what's going on in the clean energy space, kind of with the DC focus, but also with the bigger focus as well on certain topics. We'll have speakers from DOE, So it should be a great event.
That sounds great.
So those are probably the 3 or 4 biggest things.
All right, let's draw the circle a little broader now, because you're not just involved, of course, at the local level. You're engaged in a couple of regional and national associations, and because of your leadership in those roles, you're not just a seat filler. You're actually in a leadership role in the Organization of PJM States, or OPSI, as it's known as, and also the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, which we all like to abbreviate to NARUC because that's a mouthful. So they have their meeting coming up in July. I guess as we look at a couple of those organizations, and you're also involved in MACRUC, and we'll get to that in just a minute, but what are some of the current priorities that you see at OPSI, and are there similar issues at NARUC, or is it a separate basket of issues as you look at the regional and national level?
Yeah, so there's certainly overlap, but I'll walk you through a few things that we're really focused on at
Great.
OPSI, especially since it's an organization focused on the grid, right? So of course we talked about 1920. 1920 I think is hugely important, and the number of rehearing requests. OPSI, we filed a petition for clarification. We are certainly in favor of the rule, but just want some clarification on some issues there. And so, my hope is that we can get past the rehearing or in clarification parts, and possibly whatever other litigation may happen, so that we can really get down to work. I do think this rule is going to be transformative for planning the grid of the future. There's also the issue of the CTOA, the Consolidated Transmission Owners Agreement, where a few of the transmission owners, along with PJM board, filed with FERC to give the PJM board 205 rights over regional planning, which we're not opposed to in principle. I think the bigger question is there were some additional amendments that we think may have some unforeseen consequences, could cause some governance problems down the road. So that's certainly something that we are watching and checking for. I talked earlier about continued capacity reform and making sure we're doing the right thing there. And then there's another issue that we haven't formally taken a position on yet, but it's certainly something that we are watching, and that's this the issue of co-located load, and how it affects capacity resources, prices for consumers. I saw that AEP and Exelon filed a protest recently. And so that's something we're going to certainly watch, because I think it could really have effects when we start talking about cost and how that goes.
And for people that listen to this podcast, they probably know, but for the random person who may have found it and don't know what co-located load is, it's kind of behind the meter on a larger scale, where you have a data center campus and a power generating facility that's located right on site, and it eliminates some of the transmission needs and infrastructure, because you can do everything proverbially behind the meter, and is a evolving concept that I think has got interest in a lot of the data center and AI communities, as well as the power generation community, as opportunities need to be evaluated and looked at. But I think you're right. That certainly attracted the attention of at least 2 of the utilities, as well as they think about some of those issues. But given that Virginia and Ohio and a couple other jurisdictions located in PJM seem to be very attractive to data centers, this is something that OPSI is probably going to be up to your elbows in.
Oh, yes. So that's certainly on the OPSI side. On the NARUC side, you hit it on the head. We have our upcoming meeting, and I have to give that plug in West Palm Beach in 2 weeks here.
Yes, Florida in July. It will be really comfortable.
Seersucker and khaki, right?
That's exactly right.
But we have a great lineup. We have Chair Phillips from FERC giving a keynote address. Also, there will be Commissioner Christie. We'll be talking about some of these same topics around resource adequacy and the energy transition. Outside of that, I would also note that NARUC is in the process of beginning another NARUC FERC collaborative. The last one was really focused on transmission, and I think really helped with this rulemaking. But this one, I think, is going to be a little bit broader, and the mission is going to be to provide a venue for federal and state regulators to share perspectives, increase understanding, and where appropriate, identify potential solutions regarding challenges and coordination on matters that impact specific state, federal regulatory jurisdiction. So I think it'll be great. I think FERC definitely benefits from having 2 state regulators on there now, because just bringing that perspective is very helpful. So I think anytime we can have additional collaboration there will be great. So yeah, those are the big things.
How does your perspective as the chair of a DC commission inform your efforts to advocate, if that's the right word, in those settings? I mean, clearly you have a leadership role, and sometimes it's herding cats, trying to get people to agree on a position. But how does your position where you sit for your day job inform how you engage with some of these organizations? Because it's sometimes difficult to manage because there's a variety of perspectives across the region and across the country.
I think you're certainly right. Being in DC, it's very unique because not only are we sitting, like you said, where my job is, but it's the Hill, FERC, the federal agencies, and the White House. And so you're right here in the midst of all of it. And I would say on top of that, and probably just as important, the trade organizations and as well as major utilities have some type of shop here in DC. So you get to hear a lot and see a lot. And I think it kind of it gives me at least an opportunity to have a very national view on some of these issues and see where different places are coming from based upon their needs, right? So you have some states who this is a certain types of generation are an economic lifeline. You have certain states where importing the energy is an economic lifeline, like DC, right? And so it allows you to give a real broad perspective and try and figure out where there is that harmony. I think one of the things that I've seen is that nobody disagrees about reliability. Nobody disagrees about affordability.
That's right.
Nobody agrees about safety. Now, how do we get to those three things, the trilemma?
There's where your disagreements.
Right.
Yeah.
But I think having that common place where we can all start and agree, certainly at least gives you a basis for that conversation.
Yeah. It's interesting that we were talking about this now because last week, as we're recording, we were together at the MACRUC meeting, and there were a range of issues discussed. And there were state legislators from a number of the jurisdictions that were there. There were, of course, state commissioners are there. That's the purpose of the meeting. But then industry topics and kind of all of the things that we have covered, in our conversation so far. Any takeaways that you had from the MACRUC meeting, or any light bulb moments where you said, this is something we're going to have to pay attention to?
I'll say this. One of the things that we did for the first time was the Dancing with the Stars. And this, I think, was what you were talking about, where we, for the listeners who weren't there, we paired speakers up, and what was it, about a 5-minute?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. 5 minutes to talk about a topic from your perspective. Todd did an excellent job talking about the competitive markets, PJM in particular. But I thought that was a great way for people to hear both sides of the argument in a concise format that kept people's attention and really engaged them. So I really like that format. I think we're going to be replicating that a little bit down in West Palm Beach with some topics. But I thought that was an amazing concept to really engage people. And so outside of that, big takeaways, I would say, I enjoyed Commissioner Clements gave probably one of her last talks as a FERC commissioner, and it was very insightful talking about 1920. We talked about the issue of how electric companies, distribution companies, and generators are looking at resource adequacy in the transition. And so, for me, I'm a big dialogue person. Of course, when it's followed by action, but really being able to allow people to speak and really get their points of view out to you so people can understand and then make a decision. So I thought the dialogue was very insightful and informal as a whole.
Yeah, I'd agree. It's always a good place to actually have some more in-depth conversations. It was larger than it's been, but it's much smaller than some of the national conferences that make it hard you feel like you're a salmon swimming upriver with so many people that you're trying to find. So as we wrap up our conversation, Chairman, I'm curious, what's the one message or what's the one or two thoughts that you would want policymakers or other regulators perhaps to keep in mind when you think about energy and innovation? I mean, we've all got a very challenging opportunity that's in front of us, but there's got to be some kind of guiding lights that we follow. What are those lights that you'd want us as industry or other policymakers to be thinking about as we try and get through this journey together?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think as we think about this energy transition and as we get deeper and deeper into it, energy transition, energy expansion, I think we have to be bold, but practical, right? And so it doesn't mean that we can't reach for the stars, but we have to do it in a logical manner. And I think that will be the bellwether as we go through this to make sure that we're doing it right, that we are being practical as we're making these decisions and as we're making these pronouncements.
That is a great place for us to end. I don't think I could have thought of a better way to finish that. So, Chairman Thompson, we certainly appreciate you taking time to visit with us and look forward to seeing you at the NARUC meeting here later in July. And know that the dialogue, as you said, will continue. Hopefully, it'll be followed by some actions that will ensure the things that you support, as do we, which are that reliability, affordability, and safety. I mean, those are key issues that I think everyone agrees on. I think you're right.
Thank you, Todd. I really appreciate it being here today and look forward to seeing you in 2 weeks.
Thanks for listening to Energy Solutions. This August, we'll be releasing a special series focused on one of the most pressing issues facing the energy industry and the nation as a whole: the impact rapidly developing AI technology and data centers are having on rising power demand. Will we have enough megawatts to continue powering a reliable, cost-effective, and sustainable system in a changing grid? What's needed from policymakers to mitigate the strain on grid reliability? We'll find out with insight shared from a host of expert voices across all corners of the industry. If you like this episode, please share it on social media with your coworkers, friends, and family. You can also connect with us on X at EPSA News, on LinkedIn, and on Threads at Electric Power Supply. And subscribe, follow, leave a rating, or comment on Spotify, Apple Podcast, Pandora, and now YouTube. We'd love to hear from you.
Energy Solutions is brought to you by the Electric Power Supply Association. EPSA represents America's competitive power suppliers, which bring about 150,000 megawatts of power generation resources to customers throughout the United States. The music in this episode is written, produced, and performed by Let Me Hold That, Ltd. Discover the power of competition at www.epsa.org.